Thank you for tuning in virtually to the annual Minifie lecture. Thank you to Dr. Minifie and to Barbara for your support of this lecture over the years. And thank you to Dr. Lee and to the department for this invitation to speak. I am honored and I am humbled. So in the lecture today, I'd like to have a conversation about confronting systems of racism in our field. I assert that this is likely the reason as to why we have low racial minority representation. Because of this low representation, the perpetuation of white production of knowledge and white culture harms our current students, faculty, and clients of color. It harms recruitment of future students and faculty of color into our field. It harms the quality of our clinical service delivery, the content of our coursework, and the process of research. My lecture and ensuing panel discussion, I'm going to focus on illustrating the scope and the impact of this problem. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, my friend, and co-author, Dr. Charles Ellis. He is a professor at East Carolina University, and together we wrote a paper from which this lecture is entitled and the content therein. Unfortunately, Charles couldn't join us today due to COVID-related consequences in his own family. Also, I'd like to explicitly state my positionality to this topic. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what this means, positionality or intersectionality, positionality is a social and political context that creates a relationship between a person and a topic. And it's not lost on me that I am a white woman standing here about to speak on a topic about white production of knowledge. So that being said, I'm a middle-aged, queer, white woman who's first-generation college student. I was raised in Appalachia in a working class, conservative, fundamentalist Christian culture. I was forced out of my home for my decision to attend college, and my undergraduate studies were funded by the federal Pell Grants for students who demonstrated financial need. I received my education in our field and in public health from predominantly white state universities in the US. And my early clinical career was in acute care hospitals, rehabilitation centers, Veterans Administration Center, working with a wide variety of individuals. My academic career has been at predominantly white higher education institutions in the US. I'm a single parent of an adopted African-American daughter. And I state through this positionality, I have greatly benefited from the privileges of these systems about which we're going to discuss today, while at the same time I've witnessed and I've attempted to disrupt some of these systemic injustices in these very systems. So I enter the space of this lecture with great humility and with an intention to share and an intention to learn. So, our field lacks racial, ethnic, and gender diversity. The 2019 affiliate report documented that of our 200 and some plus members and affiliates, 92 identify as white, contrasted with the 2020 US Census. Also in 2013, The Atlantic ranked our field as the 4th whitest job in America. It is a problem when a majority group of educators and a majority group of clinicians control all aspects of the professional and educational enterprise. And if not changed, we're going to continue to replicate ourselves over and over and over again across generations. So this is just a schematic of an academic path in which in communication science and disorders, where it depicts movement across academic levels with yellow exit points along the way. And I think the question we can ask ourselves is, from a social justice perspective, how does the institution or department norms, practices, and systems negatively impact the recruitment and the retention of minority students and faculty in communication science and disorders. And social justice is defined as the full and equal participation of all groups in a society with equitable distribution of resources. And that is a society that's free of privilege and oppression. So I think the answer we must ask ourselves is, how are we contributing to the attrition across this career path? And I think to begin to answer this question, we need to take a look at the types of questions our field is currently asking. So we spend a lot of time focused on teaching and measuring cultural competence and diversity. These are indicators that Charles and I argue represent only the tip of the iceberg. Our accreditation body asks our programs to choose between either a standalone course in multiculturalism and diversity or infuse it into courses. And most programs have eliminated that standalone course, and instead they opt to infuse it into the content into other courses, but it's unclear how the infusion actually occurs or how it's measured. Also, we as programs are asked to diligently capture the number of represented minority students admitted to programs, how that number changes from year to year, the amount of scholarships given, the number of faculty trainings offered, and do we create safe spaces on campus where minoritized students of all the various identities can share and organize. So as it turns out with this approach, our predominantly white students are likely to leave our programs with very little understanding of concepts such as the social determinants of health, the colonized history of medicine, or even an understanding of how their own implicit biases and positionality impacts their service provision, how they impact their BIPOC students, colleague students. And this ultimately impacts, of course, our clinical outcomes. So Charles and I believe we should have deeper conversations, not only conversations, but actions centered on justice. And we need to address the oppressive systems that disrupt equity, which has created the whole problem and the whole space in which our CSD programs live and operate. But before I outline these systems, and because cultural competence and diversity are what most programs are asked to consider, I want to talk about this concept just a little more and distinguish it from an equity perspective. So in doing so, I reference Dr. D.L. Stewart. They delivered a terrific lecture about academic institutional transformation, and you can easily find that lecture online, and I encourage you to do so. In their lecture, they highlight the fact that most of higher education diligently captures indicators of diversity and inclusion, but they have yet to examine indicators of equity. And again, I want to reiterate, most institutions of higher education in which I'm adding our CSD programs live. And so to illustrate the types of questions asked of diversity of institutions of higher ed versus the types of questions asked of equity, Dr. Stewart poses these examples. Diversity asks, who is in the room? And equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but cannot? Diversity asks, how many more of, we'll just pick any minoritized identity group, do we have this year than last? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? Diversity asks, isn't it separatist to provide funding for safe spaces and separate student centers? And equity answers, What are people experiencing on campus or in the department that they don't feel safe when they're isolated and separated from others like themselves? Diversity celebrates increases in numbers reflecting minoritized student status on campus and incremental growth, while equity celebrates reductions in harm and revisions to abusive systems. So the question now comes up, how do we work at the level of equity in our academic programs? And in order to answer this question, we need to understand and define the systems of oppression that undergird the problem. Dr. Patricia Collins is a social theorist whose research and scholarship have examined issues of race, gender, social class, sexuality, and nation. She conceptualizes the systems of oppression into 3 categories: institutional, symbolic, and individual. The institutional dimension of oppression maintains a structure that preserves power and privilege. Implicit in this view is that there's not one clear oppressing group or person. Instead, structural oppression involves conscious actions of many individuals who contribute daily to maintaining and reproducing institutional structures. This has been talked about the everyday practices of well-intentioned white liberal society. So an example of work at the institutional level can be looking at admissions and asking, in what way might our admission requirements be biased? So for example, do you require standardized assessments that have known racial biases? Students from low-income families do not mostly have the opportunity for SAT prep, unlike students from middle and higher class families who have money and resources, who can help their kids obtain higher SAT scores. Student visits. If a student visits your department during admission season, do you document that visit? Does that consequently influence your admission decision? Students who can visit, they're afforded privilege. They have the resources to pay for the visits, and this unfairly advantages them over the students who don't have the resources and can't visit. Volunteer experiences. Do you require volunteer experiences for admission into your program? These volunteer experiences are afforded to students of privilege. They have availability of transportation and connections in the community, while students from lower class backgrounds do not. How about your department tenure and promotion criteria? Do you have written documentation outlining the specific criteria? And if you do, is it open source and available not only to the faculty who are going up for tenure and promotion, but to the senior faculty who are judging their dossier, and to the college council who are also judging their credentials? Along these promotion lines, is there a requirement of social justice teaching practices for faculty who are going up for promotion? Okay, let's look at the next level of oppression, which is symbolic oppression. Collins defines this as the harmful impact of ideologies on actions. And this is really stereotyping. So this has to do with the ways in which we make meaning of the world and interpret the world and understand the world through the language that we use, symbols, images, messages. There's well-documented examples of stereotypes on images held by the majority group around gender, around race, around age, around sexual orientation, around class. And Collins emphasizes that one way to dehumanize and devalue an individual or a group is to deny the reality of their experiences. So, how can we work at the level of stereotyping in our program? We can ask questions like this. Does my predominantly white admissions committee have implicit biases that disrupt equitable admissions practices? Does my predominantly white faculty have implicit biases that don't allow them to fully support their Black, Indigenous, and people of color faculty and students? Does the leadership and faculty hold regular listening sessions that afford the opportunity to hear voices and learn BIPOC experiences to disrupt those stereotypes? Is the program or department or institution providing education to our students, the white students, that will disrupt their own stereotypes? Do we incorporate information into our coursework that addresses issues of race, racism, privilege, and marginalization, and social burdens of disease and colonized medicine practices? Okay, now let's go to individual oppression. This has to do with how our own race, gender, and class frames the ways in which we participate in the institution. This is the positionality and intersectionality. I stated that in the beginning of the lecture because I wanted to frame the multiple ways in which my own race, my own gender, my own class frames my life experiences, as well as how it's impacted my view of this work. Collins points out that whether we benefit or not, we all live within institutions that reproduce race, class, and gender oppression. And each of our individuals' demographics and biographies vary tremendously. So that the treatment that each of us has received, me, as I went through this academic training and career path in higher ed, that varies widely based on each of our individual positionalities. And we cannot overstate the ways in which we walk through this world and carry this positionality has this cumulative effect in our lives across these multiple structures of oppression. So, what questions can we ask of ourselves at this level? You could ask, what is the impact of my positionality in this space? In my teaching space, in my clinical space, in the space of faculty meetings, in the space of with my superiors, in the space with my students? And what power does that positionality afford me or doesn't afford me? We can ask questions of our pedagogy. Does my clinical and classroom teachings, does it encompass increasing my students' awareness of their own positionality so that they may walk through the world differently and more aware? Activist Angela Davis says there can be no diversity inclusion without transformation and justice. So, how do we move forward? This lecture and our paper was never intended to be a primer on how to end systemic racism in our field. Instead, it's a single intention, is to shift the focus and engagement around the types of questions we're asking and the type of work we're doing. We contend that if we continue to ask questions around diversity and inclusion, it will not impact the educational systems in which we live. Furthermore, systems of oppression should be the starting point around which our organizations such as ASHA and the Council of Academic Programs and Communication Sciences and Disorders, CAPCID, and the Council for Clinical Certification in Audiology and Speech Pathology, the CFCC, engage in meaningful dialogue. So what work are these organizations doing? Well, in October of this year, ASHA put out a statement about the work that's going on. So, in looking through this statement through the lens of systems of oppression, it does seem that perhaps some deeper work has started. So, I'm going to highlight a few points here. ASHA held online listening sessions, and this was important for several reasons. One is addressing the symbolic level of oppression, which is that through listening, white individuals can examine their own stereotypes and their own impact and the impact of their own behavior. They're doing implicit bias training for the board of directors. This also is at the level of symbolic oppression. They're revising their strategic plan to address equity and inclusion. So without more details, it's kind of difficult to know which specific systems this will address, but it's really good to see the change. And the CAA is working to identify systemic issues. And the CFCC, quote, it's determining ways to assure applicants and certificate holders have required knowledge to address culture and language. This seems to still be at the tip of the iceberg, but it's kind of hard to know specifically what this means without more information. So I'm going to end this lecture by saying that I believe our profession does have the desire to change, but the question will ultimately rest on whether we want to do the hard work that's required at these deeper levels. So I look forward to continuing this discussion with our panel. Thank you so much for listening.